Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have Ralph Ellison, author of Invisible Man, versus the literary critic Irving Howe. This feud raises some interesting questions that definitely remain relevant a half-century later. Questions concerning a writer's responsibility to social change, some ongoing fissures within liberal political philosophy, and the burden of representation faced by writers of color. Now, this one actually starts with the beef between James Baldwin and Richard Wright, which you can go watch my video on that feud for much greater context. But essentially, James Baldwin took issue with Richard Wright's novel Native Son, arguing that the one-dimensionality of the novel's protagonist, Bigger Thomas, along with what he perceived to be harmful stereotypes of African-American men within that novel, made the novel fail as a form of actionable protest. Baldwin argues instead that a more well-rounded African-American character, a character of more psychological complexity, truer to life, proves a more efficacious form of socially or even politically minded writing about race. Now, this may surprise anyone who's been keeping up with these diss tracks, but Richard Wright did have friends and defenders, one of whom was Irving Howe, but that makes sense. Both Wright and Howe shared an interest in radical left ideology and agreed on the artist's responsibility to agitate for social and political change, and both men were very critical of anyone they deemed hypocritical in terms of political activism, or worse, someone who's unengaged at all. In his role as friend and admirer of Richard Wright, Howe was a staunch defender of the man's writing, which he saw as sort of this exemplar of African-American literature as it sought all sorts of social and political agitation and matters of civil rights. Following Baldwin's critique of Richard Wright, Howe writes an essay in response in 1963 entitled Black Boys and Native Sons. In this response, Howe argues that Baldwin's insistence on portraying a more rich or nuanced perspective of racial identity actually limits the work's political efficacy. He concedes that yes, maybe Richard Wright's Bigger Thomas is violent, and yes, maybe it deals in some flat stereotypes, but the book represents a clear and actionable agenda, whereas a novel by someone like Baldwin, well, doesn't. He argues that by refusing to adopt a posture of militant opposition in his writing, Baldwin is participating in a kind of liberalism that Howe just simply abhorred, one that implied a faith in American exceptionalism in which issues related to race, for instance, could be dealt with internally as a matter of psychology. In fact, Howe argues that Baldwin's favoring of the individual's internal reality is a cheap way out of militancy and protest, writing, quote, "All one can ask by way of reply is whether the refusal to struggle is a still greater price." Howe goes on to argue that Baldwin has in fact not succeeded in composing the sort of novel he describes as being superior to that of Richard Wright, writing, quote, "The Negro writer who has come closest to satisfying Baldwin's program is not Baldwin himself, but Ralph Ellison, whose novel Invisible Man is a brilliant though flawed achievement, standing with Native Son as the major fiction thus far composed by American Negroes." Having shifted his attention now to Ellison, Howe points to some issues that he sees in Invisible Man, namely that while the novel may participate in issues related to this struggle, it's nonetheless neutered by its desire to be taken seriously as literature, writing, quote, "Ellison is literary to a fault," by which Irving Howe means to say that the novel caters to that kind of milquetoast white liberalism that Howe found so despicable, and that it achieves very little. But what Irving Howe really takes aim at is Ellison's portrayal of the Communist Party, which the main character rejects in that novel in favor of a kind of self-liberation. Howe writes of this, quote, "Though the unqualified assertion of self-liberation was a favorite strategy among American literary people in the 50s, it is also vapid and insubstantial. It violates the reality of social life, the interplay between external conditions and personal will, quite as much as the determinism of the 30s. The unfortunate fact remains that to define one's individuality is to stumble upon social barriers which stand in the way, all too much in the way of infinite possibilities. Freedom can be fought for, but it cannot always be willed or asserted into existence. And it seems hardly an accident that even as Ellison's hero asserts the infinite possibilities, he makes no attempt to specify them." In other words, Howe is arguing that Ellison's novel's portrayal of African-American identity valorizes what he would characterize as the idealism and naivete of self-liberation, which Howe argues is illusory and antithetical to actual actionable political agitation and change. In case you're feeling a bit uncomfortable with a white guy telling a black writer how best to capture their lived experience, you're not alone. Ralph Ellison has something to say about that in his response, an essay entitled "The World and the Jug," in which Ellison absolutely comes out swinging. Now take a look at these opening lines. First, 3 questions. Why is it so often true that when critics confront the American as Negro, they suddenly drop their advanced critical armament and revert with an air of confident superiority to quite primitive modes of analysis? Why is it that sociology-oriented critics seem to rate literature so far below politics and ideology that they would rather kill a novel than modify their presumptions concerning a given reality which it seeks in its own terms to project? Finally, why is it that so many of those who would tell us the meaning of Negro life never bother to learn how varied it really is? Ellison goes on to accuse Howe of putting on this sort of scholarly blackface to speak of problems faced by African Americans. And in Howe's doing so, Ellison argues that Howe only further diminishes black selfhood, writing, quote, "One unfamiliar with what Howe stands for would get the impression that when he looks at a Negro, he sees not a human being, but an abstract embodiment of living hell. To deny in the interest of revolutionary posture that such possibilities of human richness exist for others is not only to deny us our humanity, but to betray the critic's commitment to social reality. Critics who do so should abandon literature for politics." Perhaps most damning is when Ellison writes about how Howe insists that Wright is the father figure to Baldwin and Ellison, and that they owe him to follow in his footsteps. As Ellison writes, quote, "No, Wright was no spiritual father of mine." And in this response I'm about to read, notice how Ellison performs some rhetorical jiu-jitsu by reinscribing Howe's notions of his own superior form of liberalism and just totally turning it on its head. As Ellison writes, quote, "Which brings me to the most distressing aspect of Howe's thinking, his northern white liberal version of the white southern myth of absolute separation of the races. He implies that Negroes can only aspire to contest other Negroes. This at a time when Baldwin has been taking on just about everyone, including Hemingway, Faulkner, and the United States Attorney General." That last bit is in reference to Bobby Kennedy, whom James Baldwin had sparred with over the government's refusal to intervene in human and civil rights violations in the South. But that's an interesting story for another day. Ellison's essay is totally worth a read, as it's equal parts blistering in its rebuttal and rigorous in its logic. But it's that last point that he made that I find so interesting, because it's still very much a problem. In my opinion, as someone who's made a career out of learning about and studying literary history, there's an instinct born of prejudice to not only compare black writers to other black writers, but to also emphasize and insist upon the African American literary tradition as a single unified thing, one in which any deviation from what we recognize as African American literature represents an artist of color giving up on some sort of social obligation they have as an artist of color, as opposed to what African American literature really is, which is a myriad of individual artists representing a myriad of different experiences within different literary traditions, representing different brands of literary thought. And it's this narrow perspective on African American art that Ellison is arguing against, advocating for the freedom to portray life as one sees fit, without strict prescription from, in this case, political ideology. So, as always, let me know in the comments your thoughts on the matter, and let me know if you have any requests for these diss tracks.